All right, welcome everyone. So we're going to begin the process of talking about fluid and electrolytes. So really what we're going to talk about are different types of fluid in the body, different locations of fluid, but we're also going to talk about things like fluid intake. So how do we bring fluid into the body? How do we undergo fluid output, right? So where does the fluid go whenever it leaves the body? Different compartments of fluid, the contents, things like that, right? So if we think of fluid as kind of a large part of our body, you can start to think of all the fluid you have in in different regions of the body. So whether that be in the gut, in your blood vessels, in your eye, in your brain, anywhere, most of that fluid, right? It's fluid. A lot of that fluid is water, right? So in terms of the kind of percentage, composition of our body, we're somewhere between 45, 50% and 75% fluid, right? So we have fluid everywhere in our body, right? Now, the amount of fluid that we have, and perhaps to some degree the location, is dependent on age, along with how much fat and muscle that we have, right? So as we age, we tend to lose body fluid. And so this is why, as you age, when you are talking about, older individuals, they're at more, they're more susceptible, that they have a greater risk, a higher risk of fluid imbalances and electrolyte imbalances as well. You can also then talk about the contents of the body in terms of fat and muscle. So fat is about 20% water, while muscle is about 75% water, right? So more muscle tissue implies a greater water content in the body, right? A greater fat content results in a smaller water content in the body, right? A smaller percentage of water in the body. Now, there's obviously some variation among individuals in terms of the amount of muscle tissue and the amount of adipose tissue, and thus the amount of water. But on average, males have more skeletal muscle, and so on average, males have a greater water content in the body, and this percentage will decrease with increased body fat, right? For again, this reason here that fat adipose tissue is just made up of smaller amounts of water, less water, right? Again, as you have variations in these percentages of muscle tissue and fat tissue, you have varying degrees of susceptibilities to fluid imbalances, right? And again, as we mentioned, elderly are more at risk. So if we're looking at this fluid, right? So if we're talking about this fluid in the body, and again, most of the fluid is water, you can then talk about where you find the fluid, right? So the majority of our fluid in our body is found inside of our cells, right? So think of your various organs and tissues and how those organs and tissues are made up of individual cells. Inside those cells, you have fluid, right? And so that fluid is aptly named intracellular fluid, right? Intracellular simply means inside the cell, right? Inside the cell. And this comes out to be somewhere around 2/3, 66, 70% or so of our fluid is found within our cells, right? Now, obviously, this fluid in our cell, it's not permanently in our cell, right? So meaning the fluid has an ability to move in and out of the cell depending on the presence of proteins, think like aquaporins when you talk about the kidneys, osmotic gradients as well. So, solute concentrations drawing fluid into or out of cells. So this intracellular fluid is not completely static, right? So there is some degree of movement of the fluid. If you have intracellular fluid, you also have extracellular fluid, right? So this extracellular fluid is all the fluid that's outside the cell, right? It bathes the outside of the cell. And really, you've got two kind of main types of extracellular, both outside the cell. One is called interstitial, and one is called blood plasma, right? So the plasma we've talked about before. So interstitial, that term interstitial or interstitium, that is simply describing the space between the tissue, right? Or the space really between the cells, okay? So the interstitial fluid, that's about 2/3 of the extracellular fluid, and then the blood plasma is about 1/3 of the extracellular fluid, right? And again, this fluid is it's moving. It can accumulate in different areas. So think of something like edema, right? So edema is an accumulation of fluid in the interstitial space. So you increase the amount of interstitial fluid, right? And then blood plasma. This is all the fluid that's outside of our cells, but it's inside of our blood vessels, right? So think inside your arteries, inside your veins, capillaries, and then of course inside the heart itself, right? So this blood plasma inside our circulatory system, and then of course within that you've got your various proteins, and you've got cells inside the blood. So again, the cells in the blood, the fluid that's in those cells, in the red blood cell, white blood cells, that's considered intracellular fluid, right? So these are our two main categories of extracellular fluid, but you've also got some kind of other fluid in different areas that are still categorized as extracellular. So these are things like CSF, right? So think cerebral spinal fluid bathing the brain and the spinal cord and the subarachnoid space, synovial fluid, right, in our joint spaces, the humors of the eye, right? So remember that term humor simply just means fluid. Fluid in our ear, serous fluids in our within body cavities. So think the pleural fluid, pericardial fluid, peritoneal fluid, and these fluids are more or less the same, right? They're going to be pretty constant throughout. However, not always, right? You can have buildup of CSF, result in increased intracranial pressure. You can have fluid buildup in the eye, and you get glaucoma, right? So you can have fluid build up in these areas, but they're more or less pretty constant, right? So with these two fluids, you have intracellular and extracellular. We said that to some degree they can move, between different spaces. You can also talk about what they're made of, right? Or not necessarily what they're made of, but what do you find in these fluids, right? So we've talked about this before in terms of intracellular and extracellular contents with respect to ions, right? So solutes. So the primary extracellular ion is sodium. Right. So on the outside of the cell, what you primarily find in terms of solutes, you primarily find sodium. When you look inside the cell, right, the intracellular fluid, the primary intracellular solute or ion that you find, sometimes you may see it called electrolyte, is potassium, right? And so you can see this nice gradient, this kind of graph over to the right, that as you move into the cell, you have more and more potassium, and as you move outside of the cell, you have more and more sodium. Now, be careful not to think that you only have each ion in one location, right? You don't. So you have sodium inside and outside the cell. You have potassium inside and outside the cell, right? You've got all these other different types of ions in both locations, but you have more in certain areas, right? You have more sodium on the outside of the cell, and you have more potassium on the inside of the cell. But again, that's not to say that you only have them in those locations, right? You've got them in several different locations, right? You can also look on the outside of the cell for other things like some protein, right? Proteins are typically too large, right, to move out of the blood openings and capillaries and end up in the interstitial fluid. So oftentimes they don't end up there. When we talked about urinary system, again, oftentimes proteins are too large to be filtered through that filtration membrane at the glomerulus, so you typically don't see those on the outside of the cell, right, in that extracellular space. But you can find them inside the cell. Again, all of our different types of transport proteins, protein channels, sodium potassium pumps, right, all of those are proteins, right? So proteins are still here, but you don't necessarily find them in large quantities floating on the outside of the cell in that interstitial space, right? So here you can see again kind of some of our compartments. You've got our intracellular, so 2/3. You've got our extracellular, about 1/3. Um, uh, Again, think of what types of things you would find there, and then you can look at a graph like this, and you can see some of those contents, right? So here you've got intracellular. Notice intracellular, the primary ion that we have here is potassium, and then when we look on the outside of the cell, both interstitial and blood plasma, primarily we've got sodium. Right, we've got other things. We've got chloride, and we've got some bicarbonate and some other smaller molecules, but primarily we've got sodium. Right. So again, think sodium primarily on the outside, potassium primarily on the inside. Okay. Now again, this fluid can move in and out of the cell to some degree, and we've talked about this in previous lectures. In previous discussions. So if you need a review on some of this, you can go back and look up, tonicities, right? Solution tonicities. But you can talk about isotonic, hypertonic, and hypotonic solutions, right? So meaning the ability of a solution to either draw water out of the cell, or fluid will be kind of promoted to go inside, or prompted to go inside the cell. Right. So in an isotonic solution, the osmolarity, or the concentration of solutes, is roughly equal between the cell and the solution. Right. So the inside of the cell versus the outside of the cell. Now that's not to say that there is the exact same number of solutes in both locations, but that's to say that the concentration is the same. Okay, so that's the big thing. Think in terms of concentration. Don't think in terms of absolute quantities. Absolute numbers. If you have a hypertonic solution, then fluid is going to be drawn out of the cell. Right, so here we've got a hypertonic solution, right? So inside the capillary, it is a greater concentration than inside the cell, so fluid is going to be lost. It's going to move out via osmosis. And if we have a hypotonic solution, so in this case, the blood plasma has a lower concentration than the cell, then fluid is going to be brought into the cell via the same force, right? Through that osmotic gradient, right? And again, that fluid is going to move until the concentrations are roughly equal, right? Again, the concentrations are equal, not necessarily the exact number of solutes are equal, right? Because again, in osmosis, right, in this process of moving water into and out of the cell, it's the water moving, it's not the solutes, right? So the gross number of solutes isn't necessarily going to change, but the concentration of solutes is going to change. Right? So we're going to stop here, and we'll pick up in our next part, and we'll begin talking about fluid balance.